In the last few months, not last few years, but just in the last few months, we've had a number of notable eruptions on college campuses that were related to protests about potential speakers that were to come, or speakers that were there. Charles Murray, who's most well-known, who's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, probably best known for his book from the 1980s, The Bell Curve, was physically assaulted, in fact, at Middlebury College in Vermont. And Milo Yiannopoulos, right, was going to be speaking at Berkeley. That speech was not able to happen. Ann Coulter, also at Berkeley. And in fact, Berkeley becomes the center of this in a number of ways, and for a number of reasons. And in some ways, you could argue in the 1970s, the free speech on college campus movements were sort of centered at places like Berkeley. And so this matters. So what I hear in the news about these things from both the left and the right is that these are simple solutions. The other side is ridiculous. They don't make any sense. So my job today is to problematize this for you a little bit, to make this a little more complicated than it might appear. We, the snowflakes, in order to form a more perfect union, establish, right? The snowflakes, AM talk radio, Fox News refers to college students, college professors as snowflakes. We need safe spaces. We need to be protected. We are worried about microaggressions, right? And the narrative gets fed by these stories about college campuses and speakers that are not able to speak on college campuses and the protests that happen. So we got to think about the snowflake phenomenon as we move forward in the talk. James Madison used to be your favorite founding father until the other guy got a Broadway hit, and now nobody wants to talk about James Madison. But we're going back to James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights. And I've highlighted, I have here the text, the full text of the First Amendment, but I've highlighted in red the part that specifically relates to speech. And of course, the Supreme Court has helped us to understand that speech is more than just words, that there's all kinds of political communication that is protected under the First Amendment. But we are talking in this instance primarily about speaking, about words that are verbally communicated. There's another reason, though, Madison becomes important for this discussion, and that is going back to your favorite Federalist paper, which is Federalist number 10. Of course, it's Federalist number 10. That's correct, which was authored by James Madison. Everybody has a favorite Federalist paper. We're not going to fight about that right now. Federalist number 10 is the best because we start to understand this conflict about the violence of faction, right? He's very concerned about what happens when you have a free society where people can express themselves, and then the potential for some people to have power and other people not to have power. And so he talks about a potential faction of a majority and a faction of a minority. So keep that in mind as we move forward, because it matters mathematically, majority and minority, but it also matters in terms of who has power. For instance, Dr. Chad, in her talk, was speaking about women in politics. We talk about women in the American political system as a minority, even though they're over 51% of the electorate, right? Or of the citizenry. So think about Madison. Always think about Madison. You should be thinking about Madison. Now, as we are thinking about Madison, this is a quote from an op-ed that was written in the Chronicle of Higher Education this morning. Tip Talks are always fresh, y'all. Tip Talks are always fresh. So speaking about the Yiannopoulos situation at Berkeley, Professor Peter Glazer from Berkeley says, all that has to happen is that Milo be invited to campus. That's all that has to happen, because then Berkeley doesn't come out looking good. Once the invitation is sent out, and this is what's important, this is why the minority part comes in. It just takes a small number of people in a student group to make the invitation, right? Once the invitation's made, he argues, then nothing can go right. No way for Berkeley to come out looking like it did the right thing. If the campus lets him speak, there'll be a horrible situation. We saw the horrible situation just in terms of his invitation, right? In terms of violent protests in Berkeley. If they don't let him speak, there's a horrible situation. And then Professor Powell, the head of the Faculty Senate, says that the formal and informal policies that for so long had worked to provide venues for all types of free speech aren't working anymore, and he attributes this to because of greater willingness from many parts of the political spectrum to engage in significant violence. And so something is changing. Something is different, not just at Berkeley, but something is different in colleges and universities across the country in terms of inviting speakers that might be potentially controversial. But is it just colleges and universities? What we have here is data from a Pew study of 38 nations. And the text, in case you can't read it, is the text of the question is, people should be able to make statements that blank publicly. criticize the government's policies, are offensive to your religion or beliefs, offensive to minority groups, are sexually explicit, or call for violent protests. And what you'll notice here is the United States is more tolerant than the rest of the world, and the median answer for all of these things. But what you will also notice is that not just the United States, but people all around the world are much less tolerant when you ask them about specific things than they are when you ask them about general things. Right? Generally criticizing the government, that's a pretty broad statement. If you ask people on the street, are you in favor of freedom of expression? Nobody's going to be like, nah, man, I don't like the freedom of expression. They love it until it's something they don't like. Right? And you can see that there's a lot of difference here, and the United States is showing trends that are somewhat bucking the world trends on this. Right? In other words, we come back harder than the other nations do. They're more and more consistent on these issues. So that's important to keep in mind, broadly speaking. And there's a lot of evidence for this in the political science and the public opinion literature. You know, studies from the earliest days of polling in the 1950s and 1960s, where you ask people how they felt about the right of people to express themselves, always very high marks. You start to ask, what about a communist? Should somebody who's a communist be able to teach in a public school, have a book in a public library? All of a sudden, no, no, no. Then you say in the 1990s, people start saying, okay, yeah, a communist can have a book in a library. A communist can teach in a public school. So the answer was, oh, we're getting more tolerant. We weren't getting more tolerant. We just weren't scared of communists anymore. Right? You want to ask that same question about members of ISIS, all of a sudden people will be like, no, I don't think I want ISIS teaching my kindergartner, right? But you probably wouldn't care if a communist did, right? I mean, who cares? What are communists going to do anymore? All right, but there's a unique text at the university. Here you have the school we love. Because universities and colleges are set up to challenge your ideas. That's exactly what we're supposed to do. That's what the notion of tenure is about. It's about protecting professors to engage in not just research, but in teaching that might be controversial. It's part and parcel to what goes on at institutions. I will point out, though, that there is a difference between public institutions and private institutions in this regard. Because, as you saw in the language of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law. That's been interpreted through the 14th Amendment to apply to the states, too, and government agents. Private schools are not. But just because we don't have the same sort of legal standards in terms of not being able to prohibit speech doesn't mean we don't have ethical standards, and standards that are, again, part and parcel to what we're supposed to do as an institution of higher education. So we come to this question about the conflict between procedural and substantive democracy. And this distinction works a little bit different in international relations, where you sort of talk about, you might have nations that are really authoritarian, but they have elections. So it looks like procedural democracy, but there's not real substantive democracy. But in the context of the United States, we talk about this just a little differently. That is, do we protect the mechanisms of democracy? Is that enough? Or are we able to sort of push back against such speech that undermines the very notion of democracy? Do we have to tolerate intolerance, in other words? And you can see how this very quickly will fold in on itself. So I have a picture here of people burning the American flag. In 1989, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Texas against Johnson that, in a very narrowly decided case, 5-4, that it was permissible that to protect free speech, that free speech must be protected in the form of flag burning, that it was a form of political expression that could not be denied by the government. That makes some of you really upset, right? And in some way, the argument is interesting because you're burning the very thing that gives you the opportunity to burn it, right? But you can understand from the other perspective, it's like if I'm prohibited from burning it, then its symbolism doesn't mean anything because you're keeping me from expressing myself, right? So we can get into very tricky waters here. My other image that I have is the Confederate flag. Again, a symbol of oppression to many, right? A symbol of oppression to many. Yet it is protected to be flown, even though it's deeply offensive to people. And so we can look at this from multiple perspectives, and I think we have to. I think that's part of it. Now, I'm going to ask you to take a sidestep with me for a second, because this part isn't political. The man you see in the image is Reverend Jim Jones. And on November 18th, 1978, 918 people died in the jungles in Guyana, in Jonestown, because he instructed them to drink Kool-Aid laced with cyanide. And I should be clear that the adults drank it, but before they drank it, they gave it to the children. So 918 men, women, and children died that day. This is why I'm bringing this up. We all have to figure out where our limits are. There was a lot of interest in what was going on at People's Temple, which was the name of the church, and in Jonestown before that. In fact, what precipitated this murder, quote, / suicide was a congressional investigation and a visit by a member of Congress to the Jonestown site. And so the question is, should he have been stopped? if there were indications that he was doing, now this is a little bit complicated because the First Amendment also has religion in it, and this is a religious group, right? But nonetheless, there's same simple questions about where the First Amendment gets complicated. Should somebody have stopped Jim Jones sooner from doing this? When I talk about this in my Cults and Genocide seminar, it's the feel-good seminar of the summer. When I talk about it in my Cults and Genocide seminar, I start with Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s on obedience to authority. And I've shown here the shock board, right? You know this experiment, right, where people are asked to administer what they think are electric shocks to somebody else when they're not getting word pairs correctly. And that lots of people go the whole way to the end of the shock board and obey the instructions, even though they believe that they're hurting somebody. And we would all say, well, I would never do that. What I always ask my students to say, first of all, you don't know that, because statistically speaking, half of you would. I think we should spend some time here and figure out which half of us would. That would make things a lot more interesting. But you don't know. But it doesn't matter whether you go the whole way to the end or not. What I want to ask is, where on the chalkboard do you break off? Where are our lines? Would you say I wouldn't start in the first place? I wouldn't pull the first lever? Or would you look at this chalkboard, which has increasing levels of intensity that you must go up every time there's a wrong answer, and decide, when will I stop? Will I stop when he screams the first time? Will I stop when he begs me to stop? Will I stop when he mentions he has a heart condition? Will I stop when he stops answering altogether and demand that somebody goes and checks and see if he's still alive? Or would I go the whole way to the end, just as I'm supposed to? Where are our lines? I got some bad dudes up here, right? Some are bad, some are just controversial. Maybe the controversy makes them bad. Would we want any of these folks to speak on our campus? Would we want advocates of these folks to speak on our campus? Would that be okay? If so, how do we engage them? Would we want protests to happen? Would we permit protests, so long as they're peaceful and not violent? If so, what about shouting them down and not letting them speak because somebody else's speech is also important? That is the speech of the protesters. What about somebody who advocates things that are taboo? Consensual incest, pedophilia, cannibalism. Could we have a speaker that comes and talks about the importance of cannibalism? Not that you'd kill people to eat them, but immediately after they die, instead of cremating them, cook them and eat them, that there would be some value to that. Should we listen to that? Is that important? Is that political speech that must be protected, that in institutions of higher education we ought to be engaged in? These are important, but that last one might not be a very important question. It's probably not going to happen, but the principle of it is very important. And so what I'm asking is to think about this. This is Dr. Stanger from Middlebury College. She was the one who was responsible. She's a political scientist, self-identified liberal, but she was going to interview Charles Murray that day. And she had her hair pulled when they tried to leave the auditorium. In fact, she has whiplash as a result of it. But she writes this op-ed in the New York Times last month where she says, quoting John Stuart Mill, "Both teachers and learners go to sleep at their posts as soon as there is no enemy in the field." In other words, we can't just protect ourselves and expect that teaching and learning will still happen. This is her argument. The university cannot renounce Enlightenment values and continue to be a university. It must be a battleground for competing ideas, not a megaphone for a particular point of view. The growth that liberal education inspires is never comfortable, and learning as a lifelong process. All of us can benefit from civil engagement with those with whom we disagree. So how do we balance that against the reality that the university has been such an oppressive place for members of racial minority groups, for gays and lesbians, for white women, for centuries, right? How do we have that desire to create a space where everybody feels welcome, everybody feels like a participant, and yet still perhaps expose students for whom that is, and faculty for whom this is very raw, to ideas that they find to be repulsive? These are the kind of battles that we have to have, and those are the kind of thoughts that we need to put on this, and I'm suggesting that we maybe have these conversations before potential situations erupt. That's all I got tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you.